Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today we are going to be doing the Lorekeeper book tag, and this was created by Brian over at BellTube. This is actually the second tag that he has created and that I have done. He's over there making great content, so go ahead and check out his channel below. But let's go ahead and jump right into the questions. And the first one is, fantasy book stack. Which fantasy world is your favorite? And this was actually a really hard question for me to answer because for me personally, it is really hard for me to separate my favorite fantasy world with my favorite fantasy series. And funny enough, that series actually doesn't have a name for the location it takes place in. Fans generally refer to it as Randland, and that is the world of the Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time is my absolute favorite fantasy series, and I look at the Wheel of Time as more of one giant long book than individual books. There's 14, 15 if you count the prequel in the entire series. And for me, it's really one long book with 14 chapters, and each one of those are the individual books. It is a world that I have spent so much time in and think about very fondly. Now, of course, during the time that the series takes place, it might not be the best place to go and visit, but it is absolutely my favorite fantasy world. Between the magic, the different cultures, the different people, everything about it, it's just something that I couldn't separate my favorite fantasy series and my favorite fantasy world here. Next up is the second fantasy book stack question. Which magical system would you like to learn the most? And this was another difficult one for me, but what I kept going back to was actually not one from books or novels. It actually came from Avatar: The Last Airbender. I would absolutely love to learn the elements, specifically the way the Avatar can. I don't want to only pick one element. If I had to, I would be a firebender, but in general, I would much rather have the ability to use everything. And that's the same way I feel about like Mistborn, for example, is probably one that a lot of people talk about. I wouldn't want to just be one of the elements or the metal users. I would want to be all of them. And that is normally how I end up feeling about magic systems where people have different abilities. I want to be the person who has the ability to do it all. So I would like to basically have the Avatar's powers and be able to control the elements and do all of the interesting, fun things that that series shows you. Next up is the sci-fi shelf. What is your favorite science fiction technology? And this was actually a very easy one for me, and I decided to pick the von Neumann probes from the Bobbyverse series. So if you don't know what that is, it is basically a self-replicating robot that can then make more of itself. And the interesting thing that the Bobbyverse series does is a person's consciousness is uploaded into that von Neumann probe, and they are then able to replicate and make another version of themselves. And that version is slightly different than the original version, but it is a technology that I find very fascinating, and the way that series progresses with the ability to explore the universe, which is something I would love to be able to do, and unfortunately will not be able to. It is just something that really sparks my imagination, and it's something that I would totally do to myself. Like, I know there are people out there who would not like upload their consciousness to a computer or something like that, but if that was possible, that's something I would totally do. I would ship myself off into outer space, just like what happens early on in book 1 of the Bobbyverse, and I would absolutely love to do that. I would love to go to space, all of those crazy things. It's something that I would totally do. So the von Neumann probe is the answer for this one. Number 4 is epic battle adventures. Which book has the most epic battle scenes? And I promise this is not just going to be a Wheel of Time list, but for me, the answer is absolutely the last battle. And actually there's another battle that happens that I won't mention here because it is a massive spoiler. I think it happens in book like 11 of the 14. If you want to know what that is, let me know down below in the comments and I will tell you there. But there are plenty of epic battles throughout this entire series. There's one that happens in book 6 that I think most people who have read the series will know which one I'm talking about. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it's book 11. It might be book 12 for the other one. And then the last battle that happens in the last book, book 14. The Wheel of Time is just absolutely full of giant epic battles with epic scale magic and just so many things that I absolutely love. So the Wheel of Time, once again, is another answer here for me. But like I said, this will not just be a Wheel of Time answer sheet. Book adaptation catalog. Which fantasy book deserves a movie or series? And I'm actually going to go ahead and alter this one a little bit because my answer for this is actually the Bloodsworn saga. So I am currently almost done. I think I'm like at 89% of the way done with the Fury of the Gods, which is book 3 of the Bloodsworn trilogy. And actually, yes, I do think this would make a good movie or a good like TV series. I think Vikings have done well in both of those mediums. But actually what I would really like to see out of the series is it adapted to a graphic novel. I really think there's so much action in, especially this last book, that visual aspect would be really well illustrated in a graphic novel kind of setting. I'm sure it would be done well in a movie and all of that kind of stuff. But I think really realistically done artwork in this world would just be like the peak of what the series could be. As much as I do like adaptations, I really do think that like getting this drawn in a graphic novel setting, especially like I said, that last book, it's such one big long battle really for the most part. it's not that I'm getting lost in the action, I just am trying to imagine it in the best way, and I really think having an artist draw it would just be elevating my experience. Villain Vault 1, who is your favorite fantasy villain? And, picking a favorite fantasy villain is, to me, probably the one who upsets you the most or makes you the most angry, irrationally angry. And I had a couple good contenders here, and I think there are much more nuanced villains that I could have chosen here, but I'm gonna go with a pretty solid choice, I think, and that is Dolores Umbridge from the Harry Potter books. She is just a detestable person, and I'm sure a lot of people will feel that same way about like Joffrey from A Game of Thrones. He is somebody who I definitely thought of being here, but reading Umbridge as such a young reader really just showed me like the injustice that somebody in power can do. Not that I realized it at that time, but I do just remember being so angry about Umbridge and just thinking about how bad of a person she is and how is she able to be the one who's in charge of the school when you had such a good person in charge in Dumbledore and just all of these things. And it's all the little petty things that she does throughout those books that really just make me dislike her as much as I do. And I think, she is one of those villains that I think for people who have read the series or have experienced it, even watched the movies, everybody knows how awful she is. And I will also say the actress who plays her in the movies does a fantastic job, and I really can't get that image of Umbridge out of my head. So my favorite fantasy villain, it might not actually be Umbridge, but she is kind of one that lives in the forefront of my mind. And like I said, not the most nuanced, not the most gray, immoral, questioning the villain, but as like a straight up bad guy, Dolores Umbridge is a pretty solid choice in my opinion. Next up is Villain Vault 2. What is the most terrifying sci-fi antagonist? And for me, this is going to be coming from my favorite sci-fi trilogy of all time, actually from my favorite books of all time, and those are going to be the Trisolarans from the Three-Body Problem. Now, there are a couple things that make them so terrifying. One, the technological superiority that they have over humanity is something that would be terrifying, right? If our first contact with an alien species was of one who was antagonistic towards us, like the Trisolarans are, and they are, above us, they are literally blocking the technology that we can develop as a human species at the time that's going on in these books. That is pretty terrifying. And also there is building dread that goes on in the series that I don't want to get too much into for spoiler reasons, but there is a long time period, let's just say, that goes on where we are dealing with the Trisolarans. It's not something where they're instantly here, things are happening and we can fight back and all these things. It's this slow build progression that I really think ramps up like how terrifying they are and how little they care about humanity. I think that's another thing that a lot of sci-fi, I felt the same way about The Mercy of the Gods by James S.A. Corey, where so many times when in stories, when humans are interacting with an alien species, there's this level-headedness, there's this even playing field that is there, and I think in reality it would be much more like somebody coming and stamping on an ant's nest and just causing complete destruction. I don't think it would be this even playing field where we have a chance. And so I think, honestly, Mercy of Gods, the Three-Body Problem, really present that idea in a terrifying way, and I think those are much more likely scenarios than the more optimistic interpretation of a first contact story. Question number 8 is world building wing. Which book has the most immersive world building? Now, I already know for a lot of people the answer here is going to be Lord of the Rings, but for me, actually, I'm going to go with A Song of Ice and Fire. When I read those books, I felt like I was there. And maybe something that helped me at the time was the show was happening. Not that I was watching the show at that time. I was ahead of the show when it came out, but maybe the show did help me visualize and like feel like I was actually there. But even when I was just reading there, just like kind of a similar thing with Randland and just all of the different people, all the different cultures. You have Westeros, you have Essos, you have, all the free cities, all these different places. It just makes it feel like a real place where there's a lot of things going on, and it's not just a straightforward, we're on a small state in a giant country that's inside of a giant planet. It just felt like we're really exploring the whole world. We're getting things from the north, from the south, everywhere. And Dorne, you have all these different places that all just feel just as real as the main places where a lot of the story is taking place. And to me, that is just some of the best world building that I have experienced. Number 9 is character classification. Who is the best chaotic neutral character? And this is something that I had to try to figure out because I have not played D&D. So the chaotic neutral isn't really something that this is maybe the best answer for. But when I was thinking about a character who is chaotic, but tries to stay neutral in a lot of things, for some reason my mind went to Geralt of Rivia from the Witcher series. And the reason I think of him as a neutral party is because he tries to stay away from politics. He tries to just do the Witcher thing of, you paid me for this, I'm gonna do it. And that doesn't mean that there isn't some chaotic moments in his adventures. Now, I haven't read all of the books, so maybe this changes. Maybe this isn't the best interpretation. I've read the 2 short stories, and I think just the first and maybe the second, like full-length novels. So that is maybe not the best, guide for his entire character arc. But however, I do just feel like at any moment in time, whatever he's feeling like, he could do something he he could change his mind on something at the drop of the hat and do something completely different. So I think he maybe fits here into the chaotic neutral kind of character trait. Number 10 is, what is the most underrated science fiction or fantasy series? So I actually have two here, and one I have finished the series and the other one I have not. So the first one is The Five Warrior Angels by Brian Lee Durfee, the first one of those being The Forgetting Moon. I think on Goodreads, The Forgetting Moon has like 3,000 ratings, and to me it should be closer to like 300,000. For me, this first book, it's my favorite fantasy book that I have read this year in 2024. I found it fantastic. It reminded me quite a bit of A Game of Thrones. I think that's an easy comparison to make between those two series, but for me it's just kind of like a heavy metal, kick-ass, grim-dark series that doesn't hold any punches. It has some similar fantasy tropes, good world building, decent characters, and just, you know, everything that I really wanted in a fantasy book, it delivered on. And I don't think enough people have read it. Maybe in like this little corner of BookTube they have, because Brian Lee Durfee also has a BookTube channel. He talks about books and everything. But I think that you should absolutely read this series. I scream every chance I get to talk about this series. And the other one is, this might be my second favorite fantasy series of all time. If not, it's definitely up there. That is the Aurelian Cycle by Rosaria Munda. Now, I think part of the problem with this series is I think it is kind of marketed as a YA book at this point. And while yes, it technically has some like YA kind of tropes, I think it is much more than a YA series. This is a series that deals with political intrigue, trust in other people, there's betrayal, just everything that you want in an epic high-level fantasy series. It's here. And I do think that the YA tag hurts it a little bit, and I do think in especially the third book there are a few moments that it leans into that tag a little bit more. I think this is absolutely a series that anybody could enjoy of any age. It is definitely something that I think people should read. I don't know how popular it is. I think when the first book came out, it might have been 2019, it got some decent buzz, but at this point, I don't hear anybody talking about it, and it is absolutely a series that I think people should read. And the penultimate question is reading challenge. What was the most challenging fantasy book you've read? And I thought about this one for a little bit, and the book that kept coming back to me was Dead House Gates. And I don't think it was particularly difficult because of the material that is going on in there. Now, that definitely does play a part in reading this book. For me, though, the part that made it so difficult was I found the middle, like 60% of this book to be incredibly boring. And I know for Malazan fans, they're gonna not understand how that's true. This is one of the greatest books ever written and everything. And like I said, I really enjoyed the 20 at the beginning and the 20% there at the end. And there are some like great things that happen in it. But this is a book that took me forever to finish. It put me in a huge reading slump, and it was because I was just bored. And honestly, reading a book that you find boring, I think is more difficult than if the material inside of the book itself is harder. I would rather deal with something that I need to read slower, really take my time with, really try to understand, than a book that I just kind of have apathy towards. And while I wasn't necessarily apathetic about that 60% section, it was probably borderline on that. And like I said, the ending of this book really saved my Malazan journey for me, because I ended up going on and reading Memories of Ice and really liking that, and I plan on reading the fourth book here soon-ish. It was definitely a very difficult book for me to get through, so it's going to take that title. And then the last question here is library recommendations. Recommend a fantasy book for beginners. So I actually have a whole video about recommendations for different types of readers. I think it's called my Fantasy Starter Pack. I'll make sure to link it, but I took my 3 that I have in that video for if you're an adult trying to get into fantasy. And the first one is a pretty obvious choice, and that is going to be Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. That is a fantasy series that have gotten so many adults back into reading fantasy, and I think for good reason. It has good political intrigue, it has good characters, it involves you into a wider universe that you can then, you know, dive into and really enjoy. So I think that's a very solid choice. The next one up is, and I've actually already mentioned this series already, and is Bloodsworn Saga, starting with The Shadow of the Gods. This is a more Norse, and well, it is a Norse-inspired mythology kind of fantasy book, and it's a little bit more adult, a little bit more grim. Definitely gives you a little bit of a different taste of what kind of fantasy it can be. And then the other one I would recommend is The Rage of Dragons. This is a revenge tale, and it is, if you are somebody who really likes manga, and specifically like action manga, I think this, for whatever reason, is a great book for you to get into. And it just kind of has that drive and that action from start to end. It doesn't slow down. It just kind of, you know, pedal to the metal for the whole time. So those are my 3, you know, really quick recommendations if you are trying to get back into reading fantasy. But once again, thank you, Brian, for creating this tag. You are doing great stuff here over in the BookTube community, and I really appreciate it. But answer any of these questions down below in the comments, any questions, anything. I'm always down there answering you guys. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.